opening the center immediately, preparing to develop pieces and seize key central squares. Solidifying the center, this pawn advances to contest white's initial central dominion. Asserting central influence, c4 immediately probes black's pawn structure, creating dynamic imbalances and initiating the battle for space. Embracing solidity, this move shores up the central pawn structure, preparing for a robust queenside development. Developing the knight to its natural square prepares for castling and contests the center effectively. Developing the knight to its natural outpost initiates black's harmonious piece deployment. Anchoring the knight, this bishop placement immediately contests black's central pawn structure, demanding a clear response to the potential pin. Developing the bishop clarifies its role, preparing to castle and reinforcing the d5 pawn's defense. Securing the central pawn chain, this subtly solidifies white's kingside structure, preparing for queenside development while sidestepping immediate tactical complications. Securing the monarch away from the d4 pawn's influence instantly solidifies black's central presence and prepares for potential queenside activity. Unveiling a queen to target the b7 pawn immediately injects early tension, creating a fork threat and forcing black to address the vulnerability, potentially disrupting their queenside development. Securing the knight on its natural outpost, this maneuver prepares for the central pawn push and subtly reinforces control over the e5 square, which could become a tactical focal point. Developing the knight to its most natural square reinforces the center and prepares to castle, a standard but solidifying maneuver, simultaneously eyeing the kingside and offering flexibility for further queenside play. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this move prepares to challenge white's queen's pressure and offers a potential avenue for the bishop on c8 to develop, hinting at future queenside expansion. Gaining dominion over the light squares, this bishop proactively seeks active placement, aiming to support the central pawns and potentially join in an assault on the kingside by first clearing the path for the queen. Embracing the pawn and temporarily conceding central space, black signals a willingness to untangle their queenside and potentially activate the c8 bishop, rather than maintaining the cramped pawn structure. This bold capture opens diagonals and might provoke white into reinforcing the center, perhaps setting up a future queenside expansion for black. Recapturing the pawn solidifies your central presence, creating a harmonious pawn structure that aims to control more space on the queenside. The bishop now stands ready to support a potential queenside expansion or redeploy to a more active diagonal. Pushing the b-pawn now attempts to create counterplay on the queenside, disrupting white's bishop and challenging the pawn chain, though it does open up the possibility of a queenside pawn majority for white if black cannot adequately support the advance. Centering the bishop on the king's flank offers improved defensive coverage, indirectly reinforcing the kingside castle, and preparing for a potential kingside attack later by subtly improving piece coordination. Expanding queenside space with a pawn thrust, black prepares to challenge white's bishop on b2 and potentially establish a pawn on b4, gaining a foothold on the flank and hindering white's queenside development. This maneuver also subtly prepares for future piece activity, aiming to open lines for the queenside majority. Initiating a pawn thrust on the queenside, white aims to disrupt black's structural integrity and seize greater territorial command. This aggressive pawn advance challenges the stability of black's queenside pawn chain, potentially creating weaknesses that white can exploit later. The move opens lines and creates dynamic possibilities, forcing black to react decisively to maintain their setup. By advancing the pawn, white seeks to gain space and prevent black from solidifying their queenside expansion. This creates an immediate tactical question for black: how to respond to the pawn push without sacrificing positional advantages. Expanding the pawn chain on the queenside dramatically reshapes the pawn structure, aiming to wrest queenside initiative away from white's aggressive pawn push. A surprising retreat, NB1 effectively surrenders the initiative on the queenside, conceding crucial space to black's expanding pawn majority. White's knight, once poised for central influence, now seems out of play, a spectator to the unfolding queenside drama rather than an active participant. This repositioning hints at a desire to avoid immediate tactical skirmishes on the c-file, perhaps intending to reroute the knight via a4 to b2 or c4 later, but it carries a significant positional cost, leaving the queenside pawns vulnerable to further incursions and potentially delaying piece development. The long-term consequences of this spatial sacrifice will undoubtedly shape the character of the middle game. Black seizes the initiative by directly challenging White's central control, injecting immediate dynamism into the position. This pawn thrust not only aims to break open lines for Black's pieces, but also questions White's piece placement, potentially forcing concessions and creating new avenues for counterplay. Unleashing the knight from its initial square, White seeks to reroute it, perhaps to f1 then g3 or even e3, to support a more active central presence and potentially contest the d-file. This repositioning also aims to unblock the queen's diagonal, potentially freeing it for more dynamic operations on the kingside or supporting a central pawn push. It avoids immediate confrontation, opting for a patient build-up and hinting at a future kingside attack, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances or piece exchanges in the center. Unleashing the bishop to its longest diagonal, this development immediately questions White's central presence and prepares to contest control of the e4 square, potentially disrupting White's planned piece coordination. Hoping to crimp Black's queenside expansion, White sacrifices a pawn's potential for space by advancing a pawn, aiming to create a permanent weakness on b4 or force Black into a positional concession if Black chooses to maintain the pawn structure. Black seizes the initiative by initiating a central pawn exchange, aiming to disrupt White's queenside structure and potentially open lines for his pieces. This action forces White to commit to a recapture, which could lead to a more dynamic middle game. Opening the central file now grants access to White's queen and bishop, but also introduces immediate potential for Black to exploit the now exposed d4 pawn. Consider how the pawn structure transforms and what new attacking avenues this opens for both sides. Initiating a central confrontation, the knight boldly ventures to d5, challenging White's queen and bishop while simultaneously reinforcing the queenside pawn structure and preparing for potential pressure along the d-file. Developing the bishop to e3 is a classic maneuver in this queen's gambit structure, aiming to reinforce the center and prepare for potential pawn breaks or piece transfers, while also eyeing the vulnerable queenside pawns after White's ambitious a4-a5 push. Shifting the bishop to d6 shores up the kingside and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, while also creating a flexible defensive posture. The knight's journey to c4 injects immediate dynamic pressure, aiming to disrupt Black's seemingly solid central pawn structure and exploit the open c-file should it materialize. Relocating the bishop to c7 abandons the defense of b4, inviting White to potentially exploit the open c-file or target the isolated pawn structure, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn chain's integrity. The bishop's repositioning to g5 immediately injects a dynamic element, aiming to exploit the pin on the knight. This aggressive placement creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces Black to address the threat, potentially leading to a shift in the pawn structure or a concession of tempo. It signifies White's intent to actively engage the center and challenge Black's development. Dislodging the aggressive bishop from g5, f6 fundamentally shifts the battleground towards the center and the kingside, aiming to blunt White's immediate attacking potential and prepare for a more solid defensive structure. Initiating a strategic retreat for the bishop, this move seeks to safeguard it from potential tactical threats on the c-file and to regroup the pieces for a more cohesive defense, anticipating Black's likely central advances and aiming to establish a more robust pawn structure against an increasingly active kingside. Pivoting the queen to the queenside seeks to rebalance White's queenside pawn majority and potentially find a more active square for the monarch, though it does leave the b4 pawn somewhat isolated and vulnerable to further pressure. A subtle repositioning, e3 aims to consolidate the knight's presence, eyeing critical squares like d5 and f5 while preparing potential kingside advances or reinforcing the central pawn structure. Asserting control over the semi-open b-file, black prepares to contest it, aiming to dislodge white's advanced knight and potentially activate the rook for a more dynamic role. Reclaiming the outpost for your bishop on c4 injects vital central influence, contesting the d6 square and forcing black to reevaluate the safety of their dark-squared bishop, which has been a linchpin in their queenside expansion. Finally, black seeks to contest the open file and activate the rook from its passive placement, a crucial step towards challenging white's central influence and preparing potential pawn breaks. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away allows white to consolidate pieces for an imminent central pawn push or flank assault, a crucial step in orchestrating future tactical operations. Black repositions the knight, seeking to bolster the queenside defense and potentially prepare a maneuver to the kingside. This subtle adjustment aims to create a more cohesive pawn structure while keeping options open for future play, perhaps a f5 push, or even redeploying the knight to g6 or h7 to reinforce against white's central pressure. Re-establishing the rook on the king's file heralds a potential shift towards centralized control, preparing to contest open lines should the opportunity arise. Instead of fortifying the queenside further, black chooses to reposition the queen, preparing for potential central thrusts, or simply finding a more harmonious placement away from the immediate threats of white's centralized knight. A subtle repositioning aiming to activate the knight from its passive square, potentially heading for e3 or d2 to support a central advance or to eye weaknesses on the kingside. Fortifying the monarch's safety against potential cavalry incursions, this maneuver also cleverly reorients the king to face the queenside rather than the anticipated onslaught on the kingside, subtly hinting at a long-term strategic shift. A strategic repositioning aims to shift the knight from an inactive square to a more dynamic one, potentially eyeing weaknesses in black's pawn structure and preparing for a central initiative or a kingside attack. Exchanging the bishop for the knight immediately simplifies the position, potentially alleviating some of black's cramped queenside space, but at the cost of relinquishing the bishop pair, a significant positional advantage in open or semi-open positions. This decision might be driven by a desire to avoid the bishop's pressure on the queenside pawns and the dark squares around black's king, or it could be a calculated risk to disrupt white's coordination. The subsequent pawn structure will become crucial in determining the long-term implications of this trade. Opening the h-file with this capture immediately targets the black king's security, transforming a previously passive pawn structure into a sharp attacking opportunity. Reactivating the knight and preparing to contest the central files. Shifting the queen to d3 aims to consolidate white's central presence, eyeing potential breakthroughs and preparing to connect the rooks, while the doubled pawns on the kingside, though structurally compromised, offer a new avenue for attack along the h-file if Black Dosen's king remains exposed there. Unlocking the d-file for its rook promises a more active role, eyeing the queen and potentially disrupting white's coordination, though it leaves the kingside slightly less defended. Redirecting the rook to its central rank aims to consolidate pressure along the second rank and potentially support a knight maneuver or prepare for a pawn advance, creating a more robust defensive structure while simultaneously eyeing opportunities to disrupt black's pieces. Redirecting the bishop to c8 finally addresses the nagging weakness on the queen side and prepares for potential exchanges, aiming to ease the pressure from white's bishop pair and offer the queen more breathing room. The knight embarks on a lengthy journey from the kingside, seeking a more active outpost on the queen side, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and potentially exert pressure along the d-file or support a future c-pawn advance. Challenging white's centralized knight with the queen aims to dislodge it and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Seeking to reposition the knight from its somewhat constrained square, this maneuver aims to activate the piece towards the kingside, potentially supporting a future g4 advance or simply finding a more dynamic outpost. The knight's journey to c2, though seemingly passive, is a prelude to more active participation, looking to redeploy to f3 or perhaps even e4 if the opportunity arises, while simultaneously freeing the d2 square for other pieces. Unlocking the center with a pawn thrust, e5 asterisk ignites a fight for central squares and seeks to disrupt white's cozy pawn formation, potentially opening lines for black's pieces, especially the queen and rooks, towards the king's flank. Unlocking the central e-file becomes the immediate priority as white repositions the rook, aiming to pierce black's defenses and challenge the isolated pawns. Reactivating the bishop on b7 offers a more dynamic diagonal, potentially eyeing the kingside once the central pawn structure stabilizes. Or it could be a prelude to repositioning for a defensive maneuver on the queenside if white continues to build pressure there. Recentralizing the queen to b3 attempts to re-establish pressure on the queenside, particularly targeting the b4 pawn and preparing to swing towards the kingside if the opportunity arises. White acknowledges the queenside blockade and seeks active play elsewhere. Reactivating the light-squared bishop to a more active diagonal, this maneuver aims to improve its scope and potentially create threats against white's queenside. It anticipates future pawn breaks and seeks to unburden the d7 square, offering greater flexibility for the knight. Clearing the way for the knight to penetrate the queenside, this maneuver capitalizes on the exposed black king by opening diagonal lines for potential future attacks. The knight boldly ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and seize the open c-file, potentially forcing concessions or creating new tactical opportunities. Capturing that pawn dramatically opens the b-file, bringing your bishop into a more active role and threatening to exploit black's potentially weakened queenside structure after they recover the piece. Sacrificing a rook to break open the center and disrupt white's development, accepting a material deficit in exchange for dynamic counterplay and an open file for the queen. Reclaiming central influence, this queen repositioning now directly challenges the exposed rook and aims to exploit the open files that black has so generously provided. Sacrificing the bishop on g2 rips open lines towards the white king, but critically abandons the queenside defense, leaving black's own king surprisingly exposed to the onslaught that follows. The white king, now exposed, trades his active queen for a bishop, a decision that might seem counterintuitive, but potentially aims to destabilize black's central pawn mass and open up lines for his own rooks. This sacrifice is a gamble on creating chaos and exploiting the newly created, albeit perilous, attacking avenues. Unearthing a surprising tactical opportunity, this audacious queen check not only disrupts white's pawn structure, but also hints at a desperate attempt to untangle black's pieces from their cramped position. Unveiling a critical defensive maneuver, this relocation of the rook to the fourth rank addresses the immediate onslaught on the king, aiming to build a more robust shield against black's unleashed queenside pressure and the newly activated bishop. Embracing the unexpected, black sacrifices material to dismantle white's regal protection, aiming for a decisive counterattack against the exposed monarch. The king's sudden exposure on the h-file, a direct consequence of black's persistent queen check, now presents a significant vulnerability that white must address with utmost urgency before more pieces are traded and the defensive perimeter crumbles. King's sudden vulnerability after the queen's sacrifice opens a dramatic endgame. The exposed monarch now becomes the primary defensive concern. The king's perilous journey towards the center is abruptly halted, a necessary pause in its risky excursion as the newly acquired pawn sacrifice at e5 now creates an unassailable fortress of sorts, a protective barrier that swallows any immediate threats and forces a reassessment of black's seemingly aggressive pawn push. Embrace the impending endgame as the queens are likely to be exchanged, focusing on the newly opened diagonal and the pawn structure's resilience. Unleashing the bishop to c5 aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the now weakened squares, creating a dynamic imbalance. Sacrificing the rook on the d-file opens up dangerous counterplay for white along the open rank and aims to dislodge black's entrenched pieces, forcing a drastic reshaping of the battlefield and potentially leaving black's king exposed. Repositioning the bishop to the central e2 square aims to bolster the defense of the pawn on a2 and potentially participate in future queenside expansion, while simultaneously unpinning the knight from the d-file and preparing for a more active role, perhaps supporting a pawn push or attacking alongside other pieces. Black boldly injects a pawn into white's territory, aiming to disrupt the currently static position and potentially open lines for his rooks. Anchoring the pawn chain and freeing the bishop for potential activity on the queen's side. A daring thrust, aiming to seize the initiative on the king's side and potentially disrupt white's newly formed pawn structure by threatening discovered attacks or simply creating imbalances. Securing the bishop against that knight's threat is a wise defensive consolidation, preventing further unraveling of your pawn structure while keeping an eye on the open files. Seizing the open file with the knight, black aims to exploit white's exposed king and the potential for discovered attacks. Unleashing a subtle yet potent disruption, the bishop swings to b6, aiming to sever the vital connection between black's rook and the queenside defenses, potentially isolating that rook and opening up avenues for further penetration. The rook's placement on the open file presents a crucial defensive and offensive pivot, seeking to activate its dormant power against white's compromised king position. Activating the queen to threaten the knight and potentially create more pressure on the d-file, while also eyeing the vulnerable c-file. Securing the king with a pawn shield is paramount when facing active enemy pieces, and this maneuver aims to fortify the king's position and potentially create escape squares. A quiet repositioning, bringing the king to a slightly safer square, now that the immediate threats on the g-file have dissipated and black's rook is somewhat awkwardly placed on d8. Activating the knight to a central outpost, this move seizes control of critical squares and prepares to disrupt white's coordination. Initiating an assault on the queen side, this move aims to liberate the queen and potentially create new attacking avenues. Sacrificing the rook, 47, c3 opens a daring counterattack, aiming to disrupt white's unified pawn structure and potentially create mating threats against the king, which now finds itself exposed on the king side. Capturing the pawn on d6 offers a chance to open lines and activate your queen, but be acutely aware of the potential for black's knight to become a significant threat if it finds its way to e3. Unleashing a knight check into the heart of white's position, black aims to disrupt the enemy monarch's newfound safety and exploit the compromised dark squares around it. This energetic strike forces white's king to move, potentially exposing it to further threats and disrupting any cohesive defensive structure white might have been building. It's a bold attempt to inject dynamism into the game when a more passive approach might have allowed white to consolidate. The monarch steps forward, seeking refuge, but the surrounding pieces seem more interested in the advancing enemy pawns and the exposed diagonal rather than offering genuine protection. The queen now retreats, seeking refuge from the immediate attack. While it avoids disaster, this repositioning highlights black's stalled attack and the precariousness of their king, now exposed after the pawn push. White can continue their methodical build-up, aiming to exploit the open lines that are slowly but surely appearing on the board. The material is equal, but white's pieces are becoming increasingly coordinated and threatening. Unleashing the g-pawn aims to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines towards the king, though it weakens white's own kingside structure in the process. Unleashing the queen to the edge, a bold attempt to disrupt white's newfound harmony and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the king. Unlocking the queen's potential along the open diagonal while simultaneously preparing to advance the kingside pawns presents a fascinating strategic dilemma, balancing immediate pressure with long-term structural advantages. A daring thrust, aiming to disrupt the monarch's safety and exploit the open lines now available. King's safety, long a secondary concern, now demands immediate attention as the enemy knight dances precariously close, threatening to unravel white's position if the monarch remains exposed. The rook's infiltration to the first rank seizes a critical open file, threatening the very foundations of white's king's safety. Sacrificing a bishop to activate the queen and create a perpetual check threat seems like a desperate attempt to salvage something from a lost position. However, black's exposed king and potential for material gain suggest this will fall short. Exploiting the exposed king, The knight's decisive strike aims to dismantle white's defenses and initiate a swift mating attack. Preserving the king's safety, a paramount concern, now takes precedence over any other considerations. Sacrificing the rook to force a checkmate creates an unavoidable sequence for white, ending the game decisively. Suddenly, the white queen sweeps across the board, snagging a pawn and disrupting black's pawn structure. But this aggressive capture might just be a tempting distraction from the underlying tactical issues and the exposed state of the white king. King's exposure is the glaring vulnerability as the rook slices across the board. Securing the monarch's escape route from the immediate onslaught is paramount, offering the king a sliver of breathing room amidst this chaotic endgame where piece exchanges have left a complex pawn structure. That queen's maneuver suddenly ignites a complex tactical sequence, forcing white to reconsider the safety of their rook on the first rank and opening up avenues for counterplay previously unseen. Unleashing a forceful check, white aims to dismantle black's defensive structure and potentially trap the king. The monarch's placement feels precarious, directly in the line of fire from the bishop and queen, creating a critical defensive vulnerability. The pawn storm on the queen's side is finally collapsing, opening a critical avenue for the white king to potentially seek safety further up the board. A desperate thunderbolt from the threatened monarch, seeking to dismantle the enemy's fortress with a swift, albeit risky, diversionary attack, hoping to create chaos and perhaps a miraculous escape route through the disarray. Hoping to escape the immediate checkmate, white abandons the last vestiges of tactical defense and chooses a desperate repositioning to avoid the mate on G1. But this sacrifice of tempo and material is unlikely to rescue the game from its current dire state. That knight's fork now forces the white king into a perilous corner, stripping away its defensive shield and exposing it to further aggression.